We're now going to have Q&A, and we will have microphones coming around the room, so you can put your hand up if you could stand and state your name and your organization. But I might just kick off with the first question to you, Libby. I'm really curious, when you first got the results from the scorecard, anything surprising to you, either in a positive or negative way, that you weren't expecting to see in those results?
I think the most positive thing, and I'll talk about the positives first. I think the most positive thing for me was seeing that nationally over 70%, in fact nearly 71% of organisations that report into us now have a gender equality strategy or policy in place. I think that is absolutely fantastic because there is certainly recognition there. I think the problem, though, is that whilst the policy and strategy might be there, there is a little bit of a problem with implementation. And one of the figures that came out from that was that of that nearly 71%, only 23% of those organisations had KPIs in place for their workforce, for their managers, around, to implement that gender equality strategy or policy. So for me, the positive is there. People are recognising it. They see it as being the right thing to do. That's great. Fantastic. But what we now have to do is ensure that we have those actions in place underneath it to ensure that we're implementing it.
And I think that's where it gets hard, particularly around flexibility, which kind of leads me to a great question for you, Michael. The work that you and Justine have been doing around flexibility, it is a challenge in a client-serving business where you have a client on the other end who may not have that same respect for flexibility that you're trying to offer your staff. How have you dealt with that in terms of how you've worked with your clients around the flexibility that you've offered to HTY?
Well, then I think that's the key. So yes, we are a client-facing business and we've talked about other enablers, but really it's about communication and about managing expectations, particularly around accessibility. In a high-performance kind of professional services client-facing environment, it's around accessibility, clients knowing where you are or being accessible. So we've done a couple of things. One is we've looked at what are the real enablers of accessibility and enabling flexible work practices. Our flexibility survey about this time last year showed us the feedback from our people was that technology was a big thing. So technology was probably seen as being the biggest single enabler of flexible work practices, again, being accessible to both the firm and to clients. But really it's about communication. So what we do, and we encourage conversations with our clients. It's around seeing what are their expectations around accessibility and levels of service, and really getting them involved in the dialogue as being the most probably important stakeholder in that conversation. That's, in terms of normalising it within the organisation, it's actually been normalised with many of our clients as well. Most of our clients are large government organisations, large retail banks or corporates. They have very sophisticated flexible practices in their own organisations, so generally it's a pretty positive dialogue, but it's just very important to have that dialogue and to make it quite normal and quite open.
So it really is about communication and leadership, and being prepared to have that conversation with a client. We had an instance a few years ago where a young team member had come back from maternity leave and was going to work flexibly 4 days a week. And the first assumption was, well, she won't work right for that client anymore. We did go out and speak to that client, and it was a pretty obvious choice. You can have someone who's known and worked around your organization for the last 5 years, 4 days a week, or we can give you someone brand new who's full-time. And the history with that client was clearly something they valued, and I think our assumption was that the work practices weren't going to work for them, and that was the wrong assumption. So you have to be prepared to ask and have the right dialogue with your clients. Now, Phil, you're a big promoter of flexibility, and I'm curious, in such a competitive job market, how important is it to attracting talent to have those policies in place?
Lena, it is, to state the obvious, pretty important, but in particular in the area we work in, where we really are looking at our STEM disciplines as being the source of our capability, and with forecasts on shortages in that area already there, but potentially getting more acute, any differentiator that we can secure is really important to us. And I am pleased to say that I mentioned that we consulted with a group of our women in terms of how we were going with our gender equality progress. And one of the, or several of the responses we got back through that process were that people had made decisions to join GHD because of the fact that we had a flexible working environment and also because of the brand and reputation. But I think it's also important in terms of talent that it's the ability to attract males, because the reality is males actually do value the working environment that where you're promoting gender equity and got flexibility. That's a win-win all round. So I think employees today are more discerning about who they work for. A few years ago it used to be environmental concerns, and probably still is to some degree. It could be integrity, it could be safety or corporate social responsibility. Well, I think now gender equality is right up there in the mix in when people evaluate where they're going to work. So I think it's an imperative if you're going to be attracting top talent.
Same with us, Lynn, as well. It's exactly the same in the legal profession. The kind of questions that were asked over the years were similar to the ones that Phil's talked about, but now we've got law clerks who are joining us, who are still at university, who are 21 or 22, asking us some pretty probing questions in relation to our flexible work practices, and both male and female. I heard a great story our last year's interview. That there was a young summer clerk applicant, a young man, who was asking some very probing questions, and not necessarily from his own perspective. He just wanted to work for an organisation that was well across this issue, and it was really him interviewing us as opposed to us interviewing him.
It's really important. Libby and I spoke about this before lunch, but both the two of you have mentioned the importance of what gender equality can do for other aspects of diversity. And, all women aren't the same and all men aren't the same. And 3 or 4 years ago, I had a male partner come up to me and thank me for the work that we've done to create a much more female-friendly environment, because it's allowed him to ask for things that he may not have asked for. So the cascade effect to all employees of getting this right is absolutely possible. I'm going to open up to see if we have any questions on the floor. Do I have any hands up? Absolutely. We have one up front with Philomena. Oh, fabulous. Excellent. Great.
Thank you very much. Philomena Leung from Macquarie University Faculty of Business and Economics. We happen to have done some study for the chartered accountants over the last 20 years. There are two major things that we found. One is the word flexibility, and it is actually important to understand that the understanding of the word flexibility from the employers and the employees are congruent, they are the same. My question is to both Phil and Michael. With your experience of introducing flexibility, do you need to explain and define flexibility in terms of the scope and in terms of how to apply? And of course, the interpretation by the employers for flexibility is, I can call on a staff on Sunday night to get something done. And the word flexibility for an employee is to be able to attend to some other duties of that employee. So I'm just wondering, with your experience, whether you need to explain that. Thank you.
Well, perhaps I'll start, Philomena. What we've done to lay the groundwork for what you said is we have a guide for the employee and a guide for the manager about what flexible working means to start the conversation. I don't think flexible working by definition means you put rigid rules around it, because there is a degree to which there's a level of uniqueness to everyone's circumstance. But what you said about at least a common platform of understanding is a really important starting point. And so I think that's just part of what you have to invest in to both facilitate the conversation and enable that understanding to occur.
Well, thanks, Philomena. It's very similar at Henry Davis York. So again, guides for both for our colleagues, but also for the partners, and really about making sure that's a very open dialogue, making it safe to have that discussion. So very similar to what Phil's outlined. But the one thing I would say is that really challenging some of those societal norms, particularly for men seeking to access flexible working arrangements, What I'd like to see happening more at our firm going forward, and we're learning from our clients in this regard, is actually having the conversations initiated by the partners and the leaders of our firm with our male and our female colleagues. And I think that's a way we could really take kind of responsibility for opening up a dialogue, because I think, looking at our Working Fathers Forum, some of those perceptions around asking for flexible work practices still exist, unfortunately. So actually having our leaders of the firm actually open that dialogue up, I think makes it a very safe conversation. But I agree, every situation is unique, and that's how we look at it.
Table 8, one of our lovely students has a question.
Hi, I'm Sunny from Sydney Secondary College, and I was just wondering, in terms of all the statistics that you've gathered and your aims to kind of promote women, where women of colour fit into this, because I know that especially like in America, women of colour not only get paid less than men, but also white women. So I'm just interested where that comes into play in your statistics and kind of your objectives.
A really interesting question. Thank you, Sunny. The data we collect is very specific, and we don't collect any data, for instance, around age, cultural backgrounds or anything like that. So it really is just about gender.
But there is clearly a challenge about the layers of diversity, being ethnically diverse, being gender diverse, being sexual affiliation, religion, and you're right, the farther you go down, the harder it gets.
That's right, Sonny. So at my firm, we're also looking at cultural diversity. It's one of the key tenets of our diversity and inclusion strategy, is looking at both not only gender but looking at cultural diversity and LGBTI and other and age in relation to having a diverse workplace. So we have started gathering those statistics. We did our first diversity census this year to really gather what we look like as a firm. I know a lot of businesses are doing exactly the same thing, and once you've got that data, you can look at how you can become a more diverse workplace. So it's very much on the agenda. I'm also part of a managing partner forum of the large law firms in Australia, and we've been looking at gender diversity for the last 3 or 4 years, and we've just switched now to really focus on cultural diversity and what it means for our businesses.
I think if I can add one thing, when I talk a lot publicly, I just suggest that we should have workplaces that mirror the communities in which we live. And if we aimed for that, then I'd be out of a job, and I'd gladly be out of a job tomorrow if we got that.
We have time for one more question.
Kate Wilson, I'm from the Environment Agency in the New South Wales Government. I thought it was terrific that both Michael and Phil, you both work from home, so you're demonstrating leadership with that flexible working arrangement. Now, my question's going to sound a bit narky, but it's actually genuinely curious that the reason for flexible working is usually to be able to also fulfil domestic commitments largely. So when you're working flexibly from home and demonstrating that leadership, do you also make a point of saying, if you, I don't know, picked up the kids or put on a load of laundry or whatever else you might be doing?
Well, I'll have a go at that first, Mike. I'm at the situation where my 3 children are actually adult children, and so I'm beyond that phase of having to pick them up from school, although 6 to 10 years ago I did overtly speak about coaching my daughter's basketball team and taking time to be able to do that in the afternoon. But these days, while I do work from home regularly, and oftentimes there's not actually a domestic reason when there is, whether it's been at home because I had a sag with my hot water system about 3 weeks ago, which seemed to take forever to get fixed. But people were aware I was dealing with a domestic issue at home, and was able to deal with that. And I think it is important, it's a very good point, to articulate the reasons for it, because that actually helps build the acceptance and also establish the need.
Like Phil, I mean, in the past, certainly when I've had other leadership roles in the firm, I've always made a point of being very overt when I have been going and be involved in something in the aspect of my children's lives, whether it be school or sport. And I certainly drop them at the station or to school many times. I still do that, but they're now, like Phil, their needs are less. But yes, when I am home, I do help out if I can. It's actually just good being at home. I mean, I am, I'm generally working. My partners are here. I need to say that I'm actually working, but I am actually working when I'm at home. But what I find it does, though, is I do feel a connection with my family, because my two eldest children are university students. They work on different hours that I work, so I actually get to see them during their waking hours sometimes when I'm actually at home working, and they pass through on the way to breakfast at 10:30 in the morning or 11 o'clock in the morning. So I do actually feel, quite sincerely, I do actually feel a greater connection with my family, and when my wife's there as well, and my adult children, I see my other children come and go as well. So there's certainly something in that. And what I have tried to do in the firm is talk about what I see as being the real benefits of that, including those aspects as well, and share that story.
Can I also say, I also work flexibly. I'd like to say I was as disciplined as the guys, but I'm probably not. But for me, when I work from home, the great thing for me is that because I start work, I get into work early, to be able to get up and go for a walk before I start my day's work is fantastic. So it's not so much for me about that connection with family. For me, it's about general well-being. And I think that that's the other thing that we need to talk about when we talk about flexible work. Connecting with family is, of course, vital. But I think it's that general well-being that we all need to ensure that we look after ourselves.
I think that's really important. We shouldn't make assumptions that flexible work is just about domestics. I have a partner who works flexibly because he wants to write a book. I work flexibly because I've taken up learning how to play a musical instrument, and it should be available to me regardless of what I have and why I want it. So I think we have to be really careful that it's not just about doing domestic work. People should have the choice for whatever is important at their life, and that will change throughout their lives. Now, I would love to introduce Jan Mason to give our vote of thanks.